In every quiet town, behind every welcoming door, lie secrets. Some are small, harmless things, a hidden diary, a forgotten promise. But some secrets are darker. They fester in the shadows, feeding on envy and desire, growing until they become monstrous. The story you are about to hear is about one such secret, born from a passion so twisted it would shatter a family, deceive a community, and stain the heart of a village forever. It's a chilling reminder that the most terrifying monsters are often the ones we'd least expect. Before we descend into this tale of love, betrayal, and murder, if you appreciate deep dives into the darkest corners of human nature, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. Your support allows us to continue bringing these complex stories to light. Now, let us begin our journey to the village of Havenwood, a place whose name would soon become a tragic irony. The village of Havenwood was nestled in a gentle valley, cradled by rolling hills that turned a brilliant gold in the autumn sun. It was a place of picture postcard perfection, where neighbors knew each other not just by name, but by the cadence of their footsteps on the gravel paths. The air itself seemed to carry a sense of wholesome purity, smelling of freshly cut grass, baking bread from Mrs. Gable's kitchen, and the sweet, earthy scent of the ancient oaks that lined Main Street. At the very center of this idyllic tableau, both geographically and socially, stood the Miller family. Michael, Eleanor, and their bright-eyed, 7-year-old son, Leo. To the outside world, the Millers were the living embodiment of the Havenwood dream. Michael was the town's only doctor, a man whose calm demeanor and steady hands had guided countless residents through sickness and injury. He was handsome in a sturdy, reliable way, with kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled, which was often. He had inherited the practice from his father, and the community viewed him with a mixture of respect and familial affection. He was not just their doctor, he was their Michael. Their house, a charming 2-story Victorian with a sprawling porch and a garden bursting with Eleanor's prize-winning roses, was a landmark. It was a home that radiated warmth and stability. And at the heart of that home was Eleanor. Eleanor was, by all accounts, a vision. She possessed a delicate, almost ethereal beauty, with long, raven-black hair that cascaded down her back, porcelain skin, and eyes the color of a stormy sea. When she first arrived in Havenwood as Michael's young bride a decade ago, the town was collectively breathless. She wasn't from their world of small-town simplicities. She had a grace, a poise that spoke of a different life, one of city lights and cultured pursuits. She had met Michael during his brief residency in the city, a whirlwind romance that saw her trade the bustling metropolis for the quiet rhythm of village life. Everyone agreed she was the perfect doctor's wife. She was an impeccable hostess, her dinner parties legendary for their elegance and her culinary skill. She was the head of the Village Historical Society, chaired the annual charity bake sale, and her presence at any town event added a touch of class. She played the part of the doting mother with flawless precision, her love for Leo evident in the meticulously ironed clothes he wore, the healthy lunches she packed, and the patient way she helped him with his homework. She was graceful, beautiful, and devoted. She was perfect. But perfection, often, is merely a beautifully constructed cage. Behind the closed doors of the Victorian house, away from the adoring eyes of the village, the air was often thick with a silence that was heavier than any argument. The perfection was a performance, and Eleanor was its exhausted, increasingly resentful star. Her life was a predictable, suffocating loop. Mornings were for Leo breakfast, school run, a quick chat with the other mothers at the school gate, all of whom looked at her with a kind of reverent awe she found insufferable. The afternoons were for the house and her duties: gardening, planning menus, volunteering. Evenings were for Michael. He would come home, tired but content, smelling faintly of antiseptic, and kiss her on the cheek. He would ask about her day, but his eyes would be distant, his mind still on a difficult diagnosis or a worried patient. He loved her, she knew that, but it was a comfortable, settled love. It was the love of a man for a beautiful, treasured possession, an integral part of the perfect life he had built. He admired her beauty, praised her cooking, and was proud to have her on his arm. but he rarely saw her anymore. He didn't see the flicker of restlessness in her eyes, the way her fingers would trace the patterns on the wallpaper as if searching for an escape route. He didn't see the woman who once dreamed of being a concert pianist, whose hands now spent their days kneading dough and pruning roses instead of dancing across ivory keys. That piano, a magnificent grand that had been her wedding gift from him, sat in the formal living room, its lid always closed, its surface gleaming with polish. It was another prop in their perfect life. In the early years, she had played for him, pouring all her city-bred passion and yearning into the keys. Michael had enjoyed it, in the way one enjoys a pleasant backdrop to their evening. He would sit in his armchair, reading the paper and murmur, "That's lovely, dear," when she finished a piece. He heard the notes, but he never heard the music. He never heard the story she was trying to tell him, the story of a woman who felt she was slowly disappearing. So, she had stopped playing. The silence of the piano was a quiet rebellion he never even noticed. Leo was her son, the one genuine source of light in her gilded cage. She loved him with a fierce, possessive intensity. He was a part of her, a vibrant, curious soul who had not yet been molded by the suffocating expectations of Havenwood. When she was with him, reading him fantastical stories of dragons and faraway lands, she could almost forget the smallness of her own world. But even her love for Leo was tinged with a subtle desperation. He was her anchor, but he was also a chain. He was the reason she had to stay, the reason she had to keep up the charade. He was the most beautiful bar on her prison cell. The resentment began as a low hum, a background noise in her mind. It was there when she smiled politely at the town baker, who commented for the 100th time how lucky she was to have snagged Dr. Miller. It was there when Michael's aunt would visit and inspect her housekeeping with a critical eye, offering helpful suggestions. It was there late at night, when Michael would roll over and fall asleep almost instantly, his breathing even and untroubled, while she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind screaming for something more. What was the more? She wasn't even sure. It was a feeling, a craving for a life that wasn't so beige. She yearned for passion, for unpredictability. She wanted someone to look at her and see the fire she kept banked within, not just the placid, beautiful surface. She wanted to feel the thrill of the unknown, the intoxicating rush of a choice that was entirely her own, unburdened by the weight of being Mrs. Miller. This particular autumn, the hum of resentment was growing louder, threatening to become a roar. The catalyst was subtle, almost laughably mundane. It was the annual Havenwood Founders' Day picnic. Eleanor, of course, was in charge of the decorations. She spent weeks planning, coordinating tablecloths, arranging floral centerpieces, designing a banner. On the day of the picnic, she worked tirelessly, ensuring every detail was perfect. As the sun began to set, casting a warm, orange glow over the festivities, Michael stood up to give his customary toast. He raised his glass. "To Havenwood," he said, his voice resonating with warmth. "And to all the people who make this place so special." He went on to thank the mayor, the fire chief, and old Mr. Henderson for donating the cider. He thanked everyone, but he never mentioned her name. He never acknowledged the weeks of effort she had poured into creating this perfect scene. She was standing right beside him, smiling her perfect smile, and it was as if she were invisible, nothing more than a part of the beautiful scenery she herself had arranged. Something inside her snapped. It wasn't a loud, dramatic break, but a quiet, clean fracture. As she stood there, bathed in the applause for everyone but her, she felt a profound and chilling detachment. She looked at her husband, this good, kind, oblivious man. She looked at the happy faces of the townspeople, all of them trapped in their own small, predictable lives. And she looked at her son, Leo, laughing as he chased a firefly, his face alight with innocent joy. A wave of love for him washed over her, so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. But right behind it came another wave, cold and dark. He was the reason she was here. He was the anchor. He was the chain. That night, after they returned home and the house was quiet, Eleanor found herself walking into the formal living room. The moonlight streamed through the large bay window, illuminating the grand piano in a silvery glow. For the first time in years, she lifted the heavy lid. Her fingers, long and elegant, hovered over the keys. They felt like strangers. She sat down, her posture perfect, just as her tutors had taught her all those years ago. She took a deep breath and then she began to play. It wasn't a soft, pleasant melody suitable for a doctor's home. It was a frantic, discordant piece, full of crashing chords and desperate, racing arpeggios. It was a song of rage and rebellion, of a soul clawing at the walls of its cage. It was the sound of her own screaming mind given voice. She played until her fingers ached and her shoulders burned. Sweat beaded on her forehead, and a tear she didn't even realize she was crying traced a path down her cheek. The music filled the silent house, a raw, untamed thing in a place that had only ever known control and restraint. Upstairs, Michael stirred in his sleep, a slight frown creasing his brow at the unfamiliar noise. He rolled over, pulling the pillow over his head, and drifted back into his peaceful, untroubled dreams. He didn't recognize the sound. He didn't hear the music. He didn't hear his wife's confession. When Eleanor finally stopped, the silence that rushed back in was different. It was no longer empty. It was charged with possibility. The fracture within her had been ripped wide open. The cage was still there, but for the first time she had rattled the bars. And as she sat there in the moonlight, her hands trembling in her lap, she realized with a terrifying clarity that she wasn't just going to rattle them. She was going to break them, whatever the cost. The first step, she knew, would be to find a key. Or, if a key couldn't be found, a hammer. The opportunity would present itself a week later, not in the form of a dramatic, life-altering event, but in something as simple as a flat tire on a lonely road, miles away from the cloying sweetness of Havenwood. It would come in the form of a stranger, a man whose eyes would not just see her, but would ignite the very fire she had fought so long to conceal. And as he stepped out of his truck, a lazy smile playing on his lips, Eleanor would feel the first, intoxicating jolt of a passion that would demand a sacrifice. A passion for which she would ultimately be willing to trade everything. Her home, her husband, and even her own child. The price for her freedom would be written in blood, and its ink would be drawn from the dark, still waters of the old village well. The hammer she was looking for arrived in the form of a man named Julian Vance. It happened a week after her midnight rebellion at the piano, on a day she had driven to the neighboring town of Stone Creek for art supplies she didn't need. It was an excuse, a small act of defiance to break the monotony of her Havenwood schedule. On a deserted stretch of country road on her way back, her tire blew out with a violent hiss. She was stranded. After 10 minutes of helpless frustration, a battered blue pickup truck rumbled to a stop. The man who stepped out was the absolute antithesis of her husband. Where Michael was solid and reassuring, this man was lean and wiry, with a restless energy about him. He had sun-bleached brown hair that was perpetually messy, a few days' worth of stubble, and eyes the color of whiskey that seemed to see right through the carefully constructed facade of Mrs. Eleanor Miller. He wore a faded t-shirt and jeans stained with what looked like paint and engine grease. "Looks like you're in a spot of trouble," he said. His voice a low, gravelly drawl that was utterly out of place in her world. He had a lazy, confident smile that was both unnerving and deeply magnetic. This was Julian. He was a transient artist and handyman, living in a rented barn on the outskirts of Stone Creek, a man who belonged nowhere and to no one. As he changed her tire with an easy, practiced efficiency, he didn't talk to her like the other men in her life did. He didn't offer platitudes or treat her like a delicate doll. He teased her, asked her probing questions, and looked at her with an intensity that made her feel both exposed and exhilaratingly alive. "A woman like you," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "You don't look like you belong in a place like Havenwood. It's a town for people who like fences." The observation struck her with the force of a physical blow. He saw it. He saw the cage. That was the beginning. A thank you coffee turned into a long conversation. He spoke of traveling, of living a life unburdened by expectations. He talked about passion, art, and the raw, messy business of being human. He wasn't impressed by her status as the doctor's wife. In fact, he seemed amused by it. He saw the woman beneath the title, the pianist with idle hands, the dreamer with clipped wings. For the first time in a decade, Eleanor felt seen. Their secret meetings became her lifeblood. They met in secluded woods, in dingy diners miles from home, in the beautiful chaos of his barn studio. He would show her his paintings bold, abstract canvases bursting with color and emotion that stood in stark contrast to the muted, orderly tones of her own life. He would touch her hand, and a jolt of electricity would course through her, a feeling so potent it made her feel like a teenager again. With every clandestine touch, with every whispered secret, the gilded cage of her life in Havenwood felt more and more like a tomb. Michael's kindness, once a comfort, now felt like condescension. His predictable routines, once a source of stability, were now maddeningly dull. When he kissed her, she felt nothing but the ghost of Julian's lips. When he spoke of his day at the clinic, her mind would be replaying every dangerous, wonderful word Julian had said to her. Leo, her beautiful son, became a more complicated figure in her mind. Her love for him was still there, a fierce, primal instinct, but it was now tangled with resentment. He was the golden chain that bound her to Michael, to this life. When he would run to her for a hug, she would hold him tight, breathing in the innocent scent of him, and a war would rage within her. One part of her was the loving mother. The other, the growing, selfish part, saw him as an anchor weighing her down, preventing her from sailing away into the new life Julian promised. "We could just leave," Julian said one afternoon, as they lay hidden in a meadow of wildflowers. "Just get in my truck and drive. Head west. No one would know where to find us. You could be anyone you want to be." The fantasy was intoxicating. A life of passion, of freedom, of art. A life with a man who saw her fire, who wasn't afraid to get burned by it. But then reality would crash in. Michael would never let her go, not without a fight. And Leo, she couldn't take him and she couldn't leave him. He was the unsolvable problem, the obstacle. The affair escalated. Their meetings moved from public places to the privacy of his barn. It was there, amidst the smell of turpentine and sawdust, that she finally shed the last vestiges of Mrs. Eleanor Miller. Their passion was a storm, a violent, desperate release of all her pent-up frustration and yearning. In Julian's arms, she was not a wife or a mother. She was simply a woman, raw and wanted. As she drove home from these encounters, the transformation would be chilling. She would pull over a mile from Havenwood, wipe the wild, sated look from her face, and carefully reassemble her mask of serene perfection. She would walk into her beautiful house, greet her kind husband, and kiss her sweet son goodnight, all while the scent of her lover lingered on her skin and the poison of her secret festered in her heart. The hum of resentment she had once felt had been replaced by the roar of a consuming flame. Julian had not just given her a key, he had handed her a torch. And as the days grew shorter and the autumn leaves began to fall, Eleanor started to realize she wasn't going to just unlock her cage. She was going to burn it to the ground. And if her family was trapped inside, then so be it. The thought, once monstrous and unthinkable, now took root in the fertile soil of her selfish desires. An obstacle Julian had called Leo, an anchor, and she knew, with a certainty that terrified and thrilled her, that anchors were meant to be cut. The idea, once it had taken root, grew with the chilling speed of a malignant tumor. It started as a whisper in the back of her mind during the long, silent evenings. What if they were just gone? Julian never explicitly said the words. He was too clever for that. But he would talk about a future free from complications, about how some ties had to be severed completely for a new life to begin. He nurtured her dark thoughts, watering them with promises of a shared dawn in a world without Michael and Leo. The architect of the plan, however, was Eleanor alone. Her mind, once occupied with guest lists and gardening schedules, now became a cold, meticulous machine of lethal logistics. She considered a dozen scenarios, discarding each for its flaws. An accident would be too messy, too unpredictable. A disappearance would invite endless questions. A search that might unearth her affair. It had to be clean. It had to be quiet. It had to be final. Poison. The choice felt elegant, befitting her. As a doctor's wife, she had spent years absorbing medical knowledge through osmosis. She knew which substances were subtle, which were fast-acting, and which could mimic the symptoms of a natural, albeit sudden, illness. Michael kept a locked cabinet in his study for certain potent medications. Over the years, she had watched him open it hundreds of times. She knew where he kept the spare key, in a small, hollowed-out book on his shelf titled Principles of Internal Medicine. The irony was grotesque. His knowledge would become his undoing. She chose a powerful barbiturate, a sedative in large doses that would cause respiratory failure, making it look like a swift, peaceful cardiac event. For Leo, the thought still caused a momentary, sharp intake of breath. But she pushed the feeling down, encasing her heart in ice. He couldn't be left behind. He was a witness, a living link to the life she was about to erase. In her twisted logic, this was an act of mercy. He would fall asleep and simply not wake up. He would be with his father. He would be at peace. She chose a Tuesday. It was steak night, Michael's favorite. The day itself was a masterpiece of deception. She baked cookies with Leo in the afternoon, her laughter ringing through the warm kitchen, a sound so genuine it almost fooled herself. She helped him with his spelling homework, her hand resting on his small back. She called Michael at the clinic, her voice full of wifely affection, reminding him not to be late for dinner. She was playing the final, flawless performance of her life. That evening, as she set the dining table with the best china and lit candles, a strange calm settled over her. This was not a crime of passion. It was an act of liberation. She uncorked a bottle of expensive red wine, Michael's favorite Cabernet. As she heard his car pull into the driveway, she moved quickly. She crushed the pills into a fine powder. She stirred a fatal dose into his glass of wine, watching the dark liquid swallow the white dust. For Leo, she dissolved a smaller, equally lethal amount into his bedtime glass of milk. Dinner was surreal. Michael was in high spirits, talking animatedly about a patient he had successfully treated. He praised her cooking, toasted to their life together. "To us, Ellie," he said, raising the poisoned glass. "I don't know what I'd do without you." She smiled and met his gaze, her heart a frozen stone in her chest. "To us?" she repeated, watching him drink. She felt nothing but a clinical detachment as the drug took hold. He complained of feeling drowsy, attributing it to a long day. He decided to turn in early. She helped him up the stairs, his arm heavy around her shoulders. He collapsed onto the bed, murmuring her name one last time before his breathing became shallow, and then silent. She stood over him for a full minute, her hand on his chest, feeling for a heartbeat that was no longer there. There was no remorse, only a profound sense of quiet. Next was Leo. This was harder. He was so full of life, his face scrubbed clean, his pajamas smelling of fresh laundry. He hugged her tightly as she tucked him into bed. "I love you, Mommy," he whispered into her neck. "I love you too, my sweet boy," she said, and for a fleeting, terrible moment, the ice around her heart cracked. A wave of nausea and horror washed over her. "What are you doing?" But the thought of Julian, of freedom, was a tidal wave that pushed it all back. She handed him the glass of milk. "Drink up. It'll help you sleep." He drank it all, leaving a small white mustache on his upper lip, which she wiped away with her thumb. She read him his favorite story, her voice never wavering. She sat by his bed until his breathing slowed, deepened, and then, like his father's, faded into the abyss. The silence in the house was absolute. It was the silence of a tomb. For a moment, she stood in the hallway between the two bedrooms, a ghost in her own home. The deed was done. The cage was open. But the work was not finished. The bodies were the last terrible secret to conceal. Her mind, cold and clear, turned to the old village well. It was deep, stone-lined, and rarely used anymore, more of a historical landmark than a water source. It was in the center of the town square, a place of public gathering. To hide her crime, there was an act of supreme, audacious arrogance. She would bury her dark secret in the very heart of the community she despised. The physical effort was a nightmare. She wrapped them both in heavy blankets. Michael was a dead weight, an almost impossible burden. She had to use a dolly from the garage, straining every muscle, her body screaming in protest. She moved them one by one under the cover of a moonless night, her car parked in the shadows near the square. The village was asleep. The world was asleep. The well was covered by a heavy wooden lid. It took all her strength to pry it open. The air that rose from the darkness was cold and smelled of damp earth and decay. She didn't allow herself to think. She acted. Michael went first, the sound of his body hitting the water far below a sickening final splash. Then she went back for Leo. He was so small in her arms, so light. As she stood at the edge of the well, holding her son's body, she hesitated for the first and only time. A single, dry sob escaped her lips. It was a sound of utter desolation. But it passed. She let him go. He disappeared into the blackness, and the sound that followed was smaller, a soft ripple that was quickly swallowed by the deep, dark water. She replaced the heavy lid, meticulously brushed away her footprints, and drove back home. She walked through the silent house, a place now scrubbed clean of the life she had wanted to escape. She went into the bathroom and washed her hands, scrubbing them raw. As she looked at her reflection in the mirror, she saw a stranger. Her face was pale, her eyes were dark pits of exhaustion. But for the first time in years, she felt a terrifying, absolute sense of power. She was free. The dawn brought with it the need for another performance, the most difficult of her life. Eleanor, the meticulous planner, knew that the discovery of the disappearance had to come from her, and it had to be perfectly timed and executed. A hysterical, early morning call would seem suspicious. She waited until 9 a.m., a time when any reasonable person would begin to worry. Her first call was to Michael's clinic, her voice a carefully crafted blend of mild concern and apology. "I'm so sorry," she said to the nurse. "Has Dr. Miller arrived yet?" He and Leo went out for an early morning drive to see the sunrise, and they're not back yet. It's not like him to be late. The seed was planted. An hour later, she made her second call, this time to the town sheriff, a kind, portly man named Bill Brody who had known Michael since they were boys. Now her voice was laced with rising panic. "Sheriff Brody? It's Eleanor Miller. It's Michael. And Leo. They're gone. He took Leo for a drive hours ago and they're not back. His phone is going straight to voicemail. Something is wrong. I can feel it." Within the hour, Sheriff Brody's car was parked in her driveway, and the web of lies began to be spun in earnest. Eleanor, dressed in a simple, elegant pantsuit, her face pale and her eyes wide with manufactured fear, recounted her fabricated story. Michael had been restless the night before, worried about a patient. He had woken her up before dawn, saying he needed to clear his head and was taking Leo to watch the sunrise from Miller's Ridge, their favorite spot. "It was spontaneous," she said, her voice trembling. "He kissed me goodbye. He told me he loved me." The tears that welled in her eyes were real, but they were not tears of grief. They were tears of pure, adrenaline-fueled performance. The town of Havenwood reacted exactly as she knew it would. Concern turned into a full-blown search party. The community rallied around the beautiful, tragic doctor's wife. Women from the church brought casseroles and pies, their faces etched with sympathy. Men organized search grids, combing the woods around Miller's Ridge. They all looked at Eleanor with such pity, such sorrow. They saw a woman on the verge of collapse, and she played the part with Oscar-worthy skill, accepting their condolences with a fragile, grateful whisper. The dramatic irony was a feast for her narcissistic soul. She was the architect of their pain, and they were trying to comfort her. Sheriff Brody, however, was a policeman with 30 years of experience. While he felt genuine sympathy for Eleanor, his instincts began to prickle. Small things felt off. For a man who spontaneously decided to go for a drive, Michael's car keys were still on the hook by the door. His favorite driving jacket was in the closet. And Eleanor, for all her visible distress, was almost too composed, her story too polished. When he questioned her, her answers were immediate and detailed, almost as if rehearsed. A truly panicked person's memory tended to be chaotic and fragmented. Days turned into a week. The search expanded, but there was no sign of Michael or Leo. No car, no tracks, no witnesses. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. The town buzzed with theories. An accident, a kidnapping, even whispers that the good doctor had a secret life and had simply run away. During this time, Julian was a dangerous complication. He called her on a secret cell phone she had bought. He was impatient, urging her to sell the house, collect the insurance money, and run away with him as planned. "It's working perfectly, Ellie," he'd whisper, his voice urgent. "No one suspects a thing. It's time to go." "No," she hissed back, her voice low and sharp. "It's too soon. I have to be the grieving wife. We have to wait. If I leave now, they'll suspect. Don't ruin this, Julian. Don't ruin my plan." The first real crack in her story came from an unlikely source. Old Mrs. Gable, the town baker who lived across the square, mentioned to Sheriff Brody that she had been awake with a toothache on the night of the disappearance. "The strangest thing, Sheriff," she said. "I heard a car door close around 2 a.m. over near the square. I looked out and I thought I saw the doctor's dark sedan. But it was parked in the shadows, and then it drove away a little while later. I thought maybe he was on a late-night house call." Brody's mind seized on the detail. Eleanor had said they left before dawn. Why would Michael's car be near the square at 2 a.m.? He filed the information away, a puzzle piece that didn't fit. The pressure mounted. State police were called in to assist. They re-interviewed Eleanor, their questions more pointed. They asked for phone records, financial statements. She held her ground, a portrait of tragic grace, but inside, a cold fear began to grow. She had underestimated the tenacity of the investigation. The turning point came during a town-wide vigil held in the square. The entire community gathered with candles, praying for the safe return of their doctor and his son. Eleanor stood at the front, her face a mask of sorrow, holding a candle. As the mayor spoke about Michael's importance to the community, his words echoed across the square, and his eyes, like everyone else's, kept drifting towards the old village well, the silent stone centerpiece of their gathering. Sheriff Brody stood at the back of the crowd, watching Eleanor. He watched her composure, her lack of any genuine breakdown. He remembered Mrs. Gable's story about the car by the square. He thought about the utter lack of evidence anywhere else. No car, no bodies on any road or in any ravine. And then he looked at the well. It was a crazy thought, a horrific, unthinkable leap of logic. But in a case with no logic, crazy thoughts were sometimes the only ones left. The vigil ended. The crowd dispersed, leaving Eleanor alone with her comforting friends. But Sheriff Brody did not go home. He walked over to the well, his footsteps heavy on the stone plaza. He ran his hand over the heavy wooden lid. It was just an old well, but his gut, the instinct that had served him for 3 decades, was screaming at him. The next morning, he returned not with a search party, but with a town maintenance crew and a heavy-duty winch. He told them it was a long shot, a part of a thorough search of all public areas. As they pried open the heavy lid and a foul, stagnant air washed over them, he saw a flicker of movement from the corner of his eye. It was Eleanor standing on her porch watching. Her face was as white as a sheet, her perfect composure finally, terrifyingly, gone. In that moment, Sheriff Brody knew. He knew what lay at the bottom of the well. The discovery shattered the idyllic peace of Havenwood forever. The winch brought up a heavy, waterlogged blanket first. Then another. The horror that followed unfolded in sickening slow motion, witnessed by a growing crowd of stunned townspeople. The bodies of Dr. Michael Miller and his 7-year-old son, Leo, were raised from the dark, silent water, their forms preserved by the cold depths. A collective gasp, then a wail of anguish, ripped through the crowd. The heart of their village had been a tomb. All eyes turned as one towards the Victorian house on the corner. They turned to the woman who had accepted their casseroles and their condolences. Sheriff Brody didn't need to force his way in. When he walked up the porch steps, Eleanor opened the door before he could knock. The mask was gone. In its place was a chilling emptiness, a void where a soul should have been. She didn't say a word as he read her rights and placed the cold steel of the handcuffs around her wrists. There was no struggle, no denial. It was the calm of a queen whose kingdom had finally, inevitably, fallen. At the station, she confessed. It wasn't a tearful, remorseful confession. It was a cold, detailed recitation of facts, delivered in a steady, even voice that made the hairs on Brody's arms stand on end. She described the poison, the steak dinner, the glass of milk. She recounted the horrific labor of moving the bodies, her voice devoid of any emotion except for a faint trace of pride in her own meticulous planning. "Why, Eleanor?" Brody finally asked, his voice heavy with disbelief. "Michael loved you. Leo was your son. Why?" For the first time, a flicker of emotion appeared in her eyes. It wasn't sadness. It was a blazing, contemptuous anger. "You wouldn't understand," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "None of you could. You live your tiny, predictable lives and you call it happiness. I was suffocating. I was in a cage, a beautiful, perfect cage that everyone admired, and I was dying inside. This was for a man?" Brody pressed. "For Julian Vance?" Eleanor laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that held no humor. "Julian? He was just the key. He was the excuse. He opened the door, but I was the one who wanted to walk through it. I did this for me," she said, leaning forward, her eyes locking onto his. "I did it for one single moment of feeling powerful, of feeling free, of making a choice that was entirely my own, no matter the cost." Her confession laid bare the profound narcissism that had driven her. It wasn't a crime of passion for another man. It was a crime of passion for herself. She had seen her husband and child not as human beings she loved, but as objects, obstacles standing in the way of the life she felt she deserved. As for Julian, he had vanished. The moment news of the bodies broke, he had packed his truck and disappeared. A ghost who had drifted into town, ignited a firestorm, and drifted away again, leaving Eleanor to face the ashes alone. The grand love she had killed for was a coward's illusion. The future she had envisioned was a fantasy. Eleanor Miller's trial was a brief, horrifying affair. The woman the town had once admired as a pillar of grace and beauty was revealed to be a monster. The story of her gilded cage fell on deaf ears. To the grieving community of Havenwood, she was simply a woman who had brutally murdered her loving husband and innocent child and dumped their bodies in a well. She was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms in prison, without the possibility of parole. On the day she was led from the courthouse to a transport vehicle, the entire town was there to watch. They didn't shout or jeer. They just stood in silence, their faces a mixture of grief, hatred, and stunned disbelief. They were burying the memory of the woman they thought they knew. As Eleanor was pushed into the car, she looked out at the crowd, at the village she had once called home. Her beautiful Victorian house stood in the distance, its windows dark and empty, a monument to a life she had destroyed. She had broken free from her gilded cage, only to find herself in a smaller, colder one made of concrete and steel, where she would spend the rest of her days. And she knew, as the car door slammed shut, that she would be forever haunted, not by guilt, but by the silent, accusing faces of the 2 people whose only crime was loving her. The freedom she had craved had become the ultimate prison, a solitary confinement of the soul from which there would be no escape. Havenwood, the town whose name promised sanctuary, would forever bear the scar of her twisted passion.